The air in the marketing department of Innovate Solutions always seemed a few degrees cooler, more sterile than the rest of the building. It wasn't just the aggressively modern decor of glass and chrome, but also the unspoken dress code that permeated the space. Sharp suits, tailored dresses, impeccably polished shoes. Conformity was king. Into this world walked David. David was a brilliant strategist, overflowing with creative ideas that had already landed Innovate Solutions 2 major accounts in the 6 months he'd been there. He had a sharp wit, an infectious laugh, and an uncanny ability to connect with people. But David was also undeniably different. He was a tall, dark-skinned man with a preference for bold patterns, vibrant colors, and clothes that prioritized comfort over corporate chic. His wardrobe consisted primarily of Ankara prints, shirts emblazoned with swirling geometric patterns and rich, earthy tones. Sometimes he'd pair these with simple black trousers, other times with denim and sneakers. His jewelry, too, was distinctly his own. Intricately beaded bracelets, a wooden pendant carved with an African Adinkra symbol representing wisdom, and silver rings adorned with semi-precious stones. From the moment David arrived, he became the subject of whispers and sideways glances. It started subtly. Sarah, the department's senior marketing manager, always seemed to arch an eyebrow just a fraction of a degree higher whenever David presented his ideas. Mark, the self-proclaimed style guru of the office, would make pointed comments about dressing for success within earshot of David's cubicle. Emily, fresh out of college and eager to impress, would giggle along, even if she didn't quite understand the joke. Honestly, it's like he's coming to work dressed for a luau, Mark sniped one afternoon while David was at lunch. I mean, this is a serious business. We're selling software, not sarongs, Sarah chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. He needs to understand that perception is everything. Clients judge us based on our appearance. He's undermining our image. Emily nodded vigorously. I agree. It's distracting. It's hard to take him seriously sometimes. The sentiment festered, growing into a low hum of disapproval that filled the department. David couldn't help but notice. He caught the fleeting looks of disdain, the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached, and the blatant attempts to exclude him from social gatherings. He tried to ignore it, focusing on his work, burying himself in data and campaign strategies. But the negativity was relentless, like a slow poison seeping into his soul. One morning, Sarah summoned David to her office. Her smile was tight, her eyes cold. David, please have a seat, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her mahogany desk. I wanted to have a chat with you about something that has been brought to my attention. David sat down, his heart sinking. He knew what was coming. Your performance has been excellent, David. We all agree, Sarah began, her voice overly sweet. But there have been some concerns raised about your presentation, the way you dress. David swallowed hard. Concerns? Yes, Sarah continued smoothly. Innovate Solutions values professionalism, and we need our employees to project a certain image. Your clothing choices, well, they are unconventional. David's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Unconventional? He repeated, trying to keep his voice level. Is there a specific dress code I'm violating? Sarah sighed dramatically. There isn't a written dress code per se, David, but there is an understanding, a professional standard. These bright prints, they're just not appropriate for a client-facing role. My clothing hasn't affected my performance, David countered, his voice rising slightly. I've exceeded expectations on every project. It's not just about performance, David, Sarah said, her tone hardening. It's about fitting in. It's about being a team player. People are talking. Talking? David challenged, a flicker of anger igniting in his eyes. About my clothes? Is that what we're doing here? Judging me based on what I wear? It's not judging, David, Sarah insisted, although her voice now lacked any warmth. It's giving constructive criticism. We want you to succeed here, but you need to be willing to adapt. She slid a sheet of paper across the desk. I've compiled a list of stores where you might find suitable business attire. David stared at the list. Banana Republic, Brooks Brothers, Nordstrom. Every store screamed conformity, erasing individuality, denying his heritage. He felt a surge of rage, but he fought it down. He needed this job. He had bills to pay, a family to support. "Thank you for the feedback, Sarah," he said, his voice flat. "I'll take it into consideration." He left Sarah's office feeling defeated, his shoulders slumped. He could feel the stares of his colleagues as he walked back to his cubicle. The whispers resumed, louder now, bolder. He overheard Mark say, "See? I told you he'd get called out eventually." Over the next few weeks, David attempted to comply, or at least appear to comply. He replaced his vibrant Ankara shirts with plain button-down shirts in muted colors, navy, gray, white. He swapped his beaded bracelets for a simple silver chain. He even tried wearing dress shoes, but the chafing became unbearable after a few hours. He felt like he was suffocating. His clothes were more than just fabric. They were an expression of his identity, his culture, his history. He felt like he was betraying himself, erasing a part of who he was to fit into a world that didn't appreciate his unique perspective. His performance began to suffer. The spark that had once ignited his ideas dimmed. He felt self-conscious during presentations, convinced that everyone was judging him. He became withdrawn, isolating himself from his colleagues. One Friday afternoon, David arrived at work wearing one of his Ankara shirts, a particularly striking one with a pattern of bold blues, reds, and greens. He'd planned to wear a neutral blazer over it, hoping to mitigate the perceived offense. But the blazer was missing. He'd left it at the dry cleaners. He decided to risk it. The reaction was immediate. The snickers started the moment he walked through the door. Mark made a show of adjusting his tie and muttering about casual Fridays getting out of hand. Emily whispered to another colleague, pointing at David's shirt and giggling. But then, something unexpected happened. A new client, Mrs. Aisha Hassan, walked into the department. She was a prominent businesswoman from Nigeria, and Innovate Solutions was vying for her account. Sarah rushed to greet her, flashing a practiced smile. "Mrs. Hassan, welcome to Innovate Solutions. We are so pleased to finally meet you." Mrs. Hassan smiled warmly, but her gaze lingered on David. Her eyes lit up with recognition. "That is a beautiful Ankara," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "The pattern is stunning. Where did you get it?" David, caught off guard, stammered, My aunt made it for me. It's from Nigeria originally." Mrs. Hassan's smile widened. "Ah, so you have ties to Nigeria. That is wonderful. My family is also from there. Ankara is a symbol of our heritage, our resilience, our pride. It is so refreshing to see a young man embracing his culture in this sterile environment." She cast a subtle, disapproving glance around the office. Sarah's face paled. She realized, with a jolt, that she had miscalculated badly. Mrs. Hassan turned back to David. "Tell me, young man," she said, her eyes twinkling, "what is the significance of the Adinkra symbol on your pendant? I haven't seen that one in a long time." David's face lit up. He explained the meaning of the symbol, wisdom, knowledge, learning, and how it guided his work. He spoke passionately about his heritage, his family, and his commitment to representing his culture with pride. Mrs. Hassan listened intently, her smile never fading. After a few minutes, she turned to Sarah. "I must say I am very impressed with this young man. He has a sharp mind, a strong sense of identity, and a clear understanding of our culture. These are qualities I value highly in a business partner." She paused, then added pointedly, "In fact, I would like him to lead the team working on my account. I believe he understands my needs and values better than anyone else here." Sarah's jaw dropped. Mark and Emily exchanged nervous glances. The room fell silent. Later that day, Sarah called David into her office again. This time, her demeanor was completely different. She was contrite, almost pleading. "David, I owe you an apology," she said, her voice subdued. "I completely misjudged you. Your clothing is not a hindrance. It's an asset. It's a connection to a vital part of the community we are seeking to engage with. Mrs. Hassan was extremely impressed by you, and her background makes this the perfect fit." David stared at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything. "We were wrong to try to force you to conform," Sarah continued, her voice cracking. "It was ignorant, insensitive, and, well, frankly racist." I'm ashamed of myself and my behavior as well as the conduct of some other members of staff." She looked genuinely distraught, her eyes filled with regret. Mark and Emily approached David later, their faces etched with embarrassment. They mumbled apologies, their words stumbling over each other. They had been completely wrong, they said. They had judged him unfairly. They now saw that his individuality was not a weakness, but a strength. David listened to their apologies, his heart a complex mixture of anger, resentment, and something else. A flicker of pity, perhaps. The atmosphere in the marketing department shifted dramatically. David was no longer the subject of whispers and disdain. He was now treated with respect, even deference. His colleagues sought his advice, asked about his culture, and complimented his clothing. They tried to make amends, to demonstrate their newfound understanding. But something had changed within David. The trust had been broken. The scars of their judgment lingered, like faint bruises that never quite faded. He went to the company's HR director, but his face was one of indifference, his actions just an automatic reply. David threw himself into the Hassan account, working tirelessly to develop a strategy that would resonate with her target audience. He excelled, exceeding all expectations. Mrs. Hassan was delighted with his work and became a valuable advocate for Innovate Solutions, opening doors to other lucrative partnerships. As the months passed, David's confidence returned, stronger than before. He began to wear his Ankara shirts with even greater pride, pairing them with tailored blazers and stylish accessories. He reclaimed his identity, refusing to compromise or conform. The question that now hangs in the air, unspoken, is this: did David forgive them? Could he ever truly trust his colleagues again? And what was the breaking point of this new relationship? And how did they decide to take matters into their own hands? Or was this the case where there will not be a forgiving ending, where the hero who made up his mind seeks his pound of flesh? The weight of their belated admiration, once a sought-after validation, now felt suffocating to David. The initial relief he'd experienced at being accepted, vindicated even, had gradually morphed into a profound sense of alienation. Their sudden interest in his culture felt performative, like they were trying to atone for their past sins by overcompensating. He became acutely aware of their eyes on him, studying his clothes, analyzing his words, as if trying to decode the authentic David they had so carelessly dismissed before. The amends were superficial. While Sarah outwardly celebrated his contributions and sought his opinion on every marketing decision, she couldn't quite meet his eye during one-on-one meetings. Mark, once his tormentor, now attempted clumsy jokes about cultural awareness, his humor landing flat and reeking of insincerity. Emily, the impressionable college graduate, followed David around like a puppy, peppering him with questions about his background, often reducing his rich heritage to bite-sized, palatable nuggets for her own consumption. It grated on him. He recognized that they weren't malicious people, necessarily. They were products of their environment, their own unconscious biases, and their narrow perspectives. But that didn't excuse their behavior, and it didn't make it any easier for him to forgive them. David felt increasingly isolated, trapped between his genuine success on the Hassan account and the persistent reminders of his mistreatment. He'd become the diversity poster boy for Innovate Solutions, paraded at company meetings and used in their internal communication campaigns. He saw his image plastered on posters with taglines like "Inclusion powers innovation" and "Celebrating our differences," each time a painful irony echoing in his ears. He considered leaving. He'd proven himself. He had leverage. He could find another job, a better environment where he wouldn't have to constantly navigate the treacherous waters of unconscious bias and manufactured acceptance. But a part of him refused to give them that satisfaction. Why should he have to leave when they were the ones who had created the toxic environment in the first place? Then a new incident occurred that pushed David to his breaking point. During a company-wide conference celebrating Innovate Solutions' recent successes, including the hugely profitable Hassan account, a video montage was played showcasing the diversity of their workforce. The video included quick shots of employees from different ethnic backgrounds, each smiling and engaged in their work. But when David's image appeared, the accompanying music abruptly shifted to a stereotypical African tribal tune. The room filled with nervous laughter. David felt his blood boil. It was one thing to be ignorant, to be insensitive, to be unintentionally offensive. But this was blatant, intentional, and deeply disrespectful. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, the sound cutting through the room. He walked out of the conference hall, ignoring the shocked gasps and the desperate calls from Sarah. He marched straight to HR Director, Mr. Thompson's office. "I want to file a formal complaint," David declared, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. Mr. Thompson, a man who exuded corporate blandness, shuffled some papers on his desk and sighed wearily. "Now, David, let's not be hasty. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. The IT department is responsible for that video, and they—" "A misunderstanding?" David interrupted, his voice rising. "Playing stereotypical music over a video of a black employee is a misunderstanding? This is racism, Mr. Thompson, plain and simple, and I will not tolerate it." Mr. Thompson stammered, "I assure you, David, Innovate Solutions takes these matters very seriously. We will investigate thoroughly, and appropriate action will be taken." David doubted that, but he held his tongue. He filed his formal complaint and demanded that the video be removed immediately and that the individuals responsible be held accountable. He left Mr. Thompson's office feeling defeated, unsure if anything would come of his complaint. Days turned into weeks, and David heard nothing from HR. The video, however, remained in circulation, played at every company event. A constant reminder of the disrespect he had endured, the frustration built within him, fueled by the injustice of the situation and the company's apparent unwillingness to address it. David started documenting every instance of discrimination and microaggression he experienced, every insensitive comment, every tokenistic gesture. He confided in a close friend from outside work, Imani, who worked as a paralegal and had experience in employment law. Imani listened patiently, her anger growing with each new detail. "David, this is unacceptable," Imani said, her voice firm. "They are creating a hostile work environment, and you have grounds for a lawsuit." David was hesitant. He didn't want to be seen as a troublemaker, as someone who couldn't handle the pressures of corporate life. But Imani insisted. She helped him gather evidence, connect with a reputable lawyer specializing in discrimination cases, and prepare himself for the arduous legal battle ahead. Finally, David made his decision. He served Innovate Solutions with a notice of intent to sue for racial discrimination and creating a hostile work environment. The news spread through the company like wildfire. Panic ensued. Sarah, Mark, Emily, and even Mr. Thompson tried to reach out to David, pleading with him to reconsider. They apologized profusely, promising to implement diversity and inclusion initiatives to create a more welcoming and equitable workplace. But David was unmoved. He had given them chances to do the right thing, and they had failed him at every turn. Now they would face the consequences of their actions. The lawsuit proceeded. Innovate Solutions lawyers fought tooth and nail, attempting to discredit David's claims and paint him as a disgruntled employee seeking financial gain. But David was prepared. He presented his evidence with confidence and composure, supported by Imani and his legal team. He testified about the humiliation he had endured, the toll it had taken on his mental and emotional well-being, and his determination to hold Innovate Solutions accountable. During the trial, Mrs. Hassan, the client whose account David had salvaged, appeared as a witness in support of David. Her testimony was damning. She described the initial prejudices she had observed within the company and her disappointment at witnessing their lack of cultural sensitivity. She affirmed David's excellent work and his invaluable understanding of her community. The evidence mounted, the testimony piled up, and the cracks in Innovate Solutions' defense widened. The media caught wind of the lawsuit, and the company's reputation suffered a significant blow. Eventually, Innovate Solutions agreed to settle the case out of court. The terms of the settlement were confidential, but it was widely understood that David received a substantial financial compensation. More importantly, as part of the agreement, Innovate Solutions was required to implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, to establish a formal complaint mechanism for employees who experience discrimination, and to hire a diversity and inclusion officer to oversee these efforts. David left Innovate Solutions. He used the settlement money to start his own marketing consultancy, specializing in culturally sensitive campaigns that targeted underserved communities. He hired a diverse team, created a supportive and inclusive work environment, and built a thriving business that celebrated and embraced individuality. Years later, David walked into Innovate Solutions with Mrs. Hassan. He had a deal with Innovate to consult them on this next account they won. As David sits there, giving suggestions with an impressive new image in the board, his eyes suddenly meet Sarah's. They have the opportunity to change each other's lives for good or bad.